because I'd like to see if you can hear the parallels that the God's God experienced this past week. So I've rewritten it a little bit, and you can follow along on your version of Nehemiah. We went to Guatemala, and we were there for 7 days. We set out early one morning with a few very dedicated disciples. We told some where God was leading us. However, we ourselves were uncertain as we boarded the plane. We traveled from the gates of BWI toward the port of Miami, and finally, in the darkness of night, we landed in the city of Guatemala. After examining the walls of the schools and the churches, we set out on our work. We poured concrete floors for the kitchen, painted walls sea foam green and terracotta red. Hour after hour we worked. After examining the protection wall which surrounded the school, we laboriously chipped paint and plaster off all the cinder blocks and built the wall. At times there was hardly enough room for us to move inside the small walls of makeshift homes as we installed wood-burning stoves in place of hollowed-out trash cans. Many in the world cared not to notice those they deemed unworthy and unclean. We were noticed by those in the towns we served, but more importantly, the walls, floors, stoves, and meals we served forced people to see that which they left in ruin. And now we will say, you see the trouble we are in. Guatemala lies in ruins. We can no longer pretend not to see. Today, I had planned on talking about sin and absolution. And in some ways we are, just very, very differently than how I had planned. And as I sort of struggled with this, do I go with my plan? Do I mess up the bulletin? What do I do? And I thought, well, this is often the way it is with God. So this past week, many of us traveled to Guatemala, and we witnessed God writing the unfathomable. There's a lot that's wrong in this world. A lot of pain and heartache and brokenness. A lot of that ugly word we call sin. If you ask any of our youth, any of these, like if you don't already know this, these amazingly compassionate, courageous builders of the kingdom of God, they will tell you that in the past week of their lives, they've seen it all. And we're working on a time in August when we can show you pictures and have the youth talk to you all about it. And I hope when we figure out that time that you will all come. But there's one huge God thing that I want to share with you this morning. We spent hours, and I mean hours, probably 48 hours of combined person power, chipping paint off a wall. This wall was maybe 200 feet long and 10 feet high. And if we had had a power washer, this is what we kept saying, if we only had a power washer, we could have done it in a couple hours, and maybe one or two people could have had it completed. But we didn't have that. We had hammers, and a few chisels, and an axe, and a machete. The machete was a very big hit. And we didn't have a ladder. Actually, if you ask for a church, he would say that's not true. We did have a ladder. We had half of an old broken wooden ladder that could support Richard's weight, and that was about it. So we stood on old oil drums as we precariously balanced ourselves on cobblestone streets, and we chipped, and we chipped, and we chipped. And every once in a while, we would get a big chunk of paint off, and then we would all celebrate. Because it took about an hour to chip one cinder block of paint clean. It felt like this was a job that was going to last forever. So every once in a while, we're standing there, every once in a while I would get tired and I would step back to rest my arm. And every single time I did that, I felt dejected. Because stepping back always was so disheartening. Up close, it looked like I was accomplishing so much. We had patiently been working on that wall, persevering and trying hard to rebuild the wall. And as we looked at it, we knew we still had a long, long way to go. So mid-afternoon on Thursday, I needed a break. My hair and everybody else's hair was coated with a thin coat of plaster dust, and the sweat and the rain had caked it to my head, and I was hot and I was grouchy, and Kirk said, "Why don't you go take a break?" And I took him up on it. So I grabbed Carter and we walked down to the square to get an ice cream cone, and we laughed and we browsed through some shops. And after about an hour, we headed back to the school. And as we turned the corner, I noticed that the wall was almost completely finished. That little space of time when I came back, it seemed possible. It seemed doable. It seemed like it was really within our grasp. And that break allowed me to see the impact of all those little minutes of chipping away. That the little efforts that we do really do add up to something huge. But I have to tell you something. At the beginning of the week, what we thought we were going to do on this wall was we were going to paint it. But the directors of the school, they didn't want it just painted over. They wanted all this paint and plaster chipped off first. They wanted all the old stuff cleared away. They didn't want us to put on a quick fix. Our mission director even told the man it was impossible. And Ana Luisa, one of the women who worked there, she shook her head and she smiled and she said, "No, es posible. I can't remember patience. Se paciente." So basically she was saying, it's possible. You just have to be patient. But now, as I turned the corner, I knew that she was right. I did just have to be patient. So I climbed back up on my oil drum and started to chip again. And as I picked up my chisel, I thought, and I said aloud to a few people there, this is what it's like to build the kingdom of God. There's no power washing, and there's no easier way, and there's no glossing over the mess. There is only slowly clearing away the broken, messed up pieces so that new can be built up. Building the kingdom of God is magnificent, and it often doesn't seem like it is. Often it's like rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, or chipping away paint in Guatemala, or supporting local merchants, or listening and honoring differences. It's really not very glamorous. It's often slow, dejecting work that sometimes goes unseen by everybody except for God and the person whose life you have changed forever. There was a lot of effort and a lot of sweat and long hours which went into that wall. But it really wasn't ever about the wall. I think sometimes people wonder why some of these very random stories, like the one we have in Nehemiah, end up in the Bible. They seem so very mundane, ordinary, and pointless. They don't seem very extraordinary. They don't seem very much like the God stuff of life. When I was thinking about preaching today, I said to Kirk, the perfect thing would be to preach on Nehemiah, because that's what the whole book of Nehemiah is about. It's about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Because that's exactly what we did for God and for the people of Guatemala. The youth here, the youth that you all have shaped their faith and raised them up in this place, they built the kingdom of God this past week. And it's not done. They still have work to do. We still have work to do. The long, patient view is necessary, because otherwise we will get discouraged. We can feel as if God's work is impossible, and the small accomplishments are dwarfed in comparison to the magnitude of the work. And I'll tell you something that I learned this past week. Accomplishing it all is beyond our efforts. We cannot do it all. This past week we didn't do it all. We finished chipping all the paint off and we left it there for some other group to come in and paint and finish. But what we're meant to do is to bring God's love, God's vision, and God's house a little bit closer by actively participating in building it up. Which, what we all learned this week, sometimes means you have to tear things down first. I think that everyone who went on this trip would agree that building the kingdom of God means that we only accomplish a tiny fraction of the magnificent venture that's God's work. And that tiny fraction can make a huge difference to the person who's been waiting their whole life for a sign from God. The hand of God has been gracious upon us. And now we must say, let us continue building, committing ourselves to God's work. Thanks be to God for each of you, workers in and